Imagine being stripped of everything you've ever known, your homeland, your language, your identity, and forced to walk thousands of miles through hostile territory just to stay alive. Picture losing not just a battle, but your entire world, and then having to rebuild it from nothing in a place so foreign that even the stars look wrong. This isn't fiction. This is what may have happened to thousands of Roman legionaries who vanished from history after one of Rome's most catastrophic defeats, only to possibly resurface years later as warriors fighting for the Chinese Empire. In 53 BC, outside the dusty fortress town of Karhai in what's now Turkey, 40,000 Roman soldiers learned that all their training, all their discipline, all their legendary tactics meant nothing against an enemy that refused to fight by Roman rules. The Parthians didn't line up in neat formations. They didn't charge with shields locked. Instead, they rode circles around the Romans, raining down arrows from horseback, turning the desert into a killing field where heavy infantry became sitting targets. But this story isn't really about that battle. It's about what came after, about survival, about 10,000 men who were marched into captivity and disappeared from Roman records forever, and about a theory so extraordinary that it sounds like fantasy, that some of these lost legionaries didn't just survive, they traveled across half the world and ended up as soldiers in ancient China, founding a Roman settlement on the edge of the Chinese Empire. The morning after Karhai, survival meant forgetting everything that had made you a Roman soldier. Your bronze armor, your gladius, your shield with its eagle emblems, all of it was gone. The Parthians didn't want Roman equipment. They wanted Roman bodies for labor and Roman knowledge for their armies. But first, they needed to keep their new prisoners alive long enough to be useful. The captured legionaries found themselves bound with rough hemp rope, their hands tied behind their backs with knots designed to tighten if you struggled. The Parthians weren't cruel for sport. They were practical. A prisoner who could walk was valuable. A prisoner who had to be carried was a burden. So they learned quickly. Keep up or die. The first challenge wasn't the rope or the guards. It was thirst. The Parthians had deliberately led the Romans deep into the desert before springing their trap, and now those same waterless stretches had to be crossed again. But this time there were no Roman supply trains, no carefully planned water stop. The prisoners got what their captors could spare, and that wasn't much. They learned to time their drinking. A few drops at dawn to wet the mouth, another small sip at midday, held under the tongue to last longer. The rest saved for evening, when the body needed it most to recover from the day's march. Veterans who had served on desert campaigns taught the younger men to breathe through their noses, to keep their mouths shut against the dry air that could steal moisture faster than sweat. Walking became an art of conservation. Unlike the organized marches they were used to, where Roman engineering had built roads and planned rest stops, this was survival walking. They learned to place their feet carefully, to avoid the loose sand that would waste energy. They figured out how to walk in the footsteps of the man ahead, creating a packed trail that made each step easier. When the leather of their boots gave out, and it gave out quickly on the hot sand and sharp rocks, they improvised. Strips torn from tunics became foot wrapping. Bits of leather salvaged from abandoned equipment got tied around feet with whatever cord they could find. Some wrapped their feet in cloth and then bound that with strips of leather, creating crude but functional protection. The Parthians moved them at night when possible, but during the day, shade was life. They learned to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion in each other. The glassy stare, the stumbling gait, the silence that meant a man was too far gone to complain. When someone started to falter, others would quietly support him, sharing their own precious water, creating shade with their bodies during rest stops. Food was whatever the Parthians could spare, and whatever could be dried dates, handfuls of grain, sometimes strips of salted meat that had to be softened in the mouth before it could be chewed. They learned to eat insects when they found them. Anything with protein was valuable. Even grass seeds collected during brief stops and ground between rocks could be mixed with water to create something like porridge. But the hardest adaptation wasn't physical, it was mental. These men had been trained to think like Romans, disciplined, organized, part of a machine that conquered the known world. Now they had to think like prisoners. They had to swallow their pride, accept orders from men they'd been taught to see as barbarians, and focus on just one thing: staying alive long enough to see what came next. After weeks of marching, the surviving prisoners found themselves in Merv, on the eastern edge of the Parthian Empire in what's now Turkmenistan. Here, thousands of miles from Rome, they learned the first rule of survival as foreign captives. Your old identity was worthless, but your skills might keep you breathing. The Parthians didn't waste resources on useless prisoners. The Romans were sorted like livestock. Those who were injured, sick, or too old were separated and never seen again. The rest were evaluated for what they could do. Blacksmiths, carpenters, engineers, men with useful trades found themselves in better condition, but most were ordinary soldiers. And soldiers had only one valuable skill: fighting. Living quarters were whatever could be hastily built. Mud brick barracks with dirt floors, no windows, and barely enough room to lie down. Unlike Roman military camps with their organized layouts and proper sanitation, this was just survival shelter. They slept on straw mats when they were lucky, on bare ground when they weren't. Privacy was a memory. Everything was shared, whether you wanted to share it or not. Water came from wells, but not clean Roman wells with proper drainage. These were simple holes dug into the ground, often contaminated by runoff and waste. The prisoners learned to let water settle in containers, to skim off the surface scum, and to drink from the clearest part they could find. Dysentery was constant. Keeping hydrated while your body was rejecting everything you put into it became a daily battle. Food was survival rations. Barley porridge, flat bread, whatever vegetables hadn't rotted, sometimes mutton, usually tough and stringy from old animals. They learned to eat everything given to them, even when it was barely digestible. Wasting food meant hunger later, and hunger meant weakness, and weakness meant you might not be selected for the easier work details. But the real adaptation was learning Parthian ways of fight. Roman tactics were useless here. The testudo formation that had been drilled into them was designed for European battlefields, not for the mobile warfare the Parthians practiced. They had to learn to think like cavalry troops, to understand how mounted archers operated, to see battle as a flowing thing rather than the rigid discipline they'd known. Training was brutal, but practical. Parthian weapons were different. Lighter bows, curved swords, different armor. The Romans had to retrain their muscle memory, learn new stances, new techniques. Those who adapted quickly got better food, better equipment, better chances of survival. Those who couldn't were assigned to the hardest labor details, building fortifications in the scorching heat. Language became survival. Without understanding orders, you couldn't follow them. Without communicating needs, you went without. The Romans created their own system. A few men who picked up Parthian quickly became translators for the other. They developed a mixture of Latin, Parthian, and gesture that let them function as a unit within the larger Parthian structure. Living among the Parthians meant understanding their rules, not Roman rules. Respect was earned differently. Authority worked different. Even simple things like meal times, sleeping arrangements, and work schedules followed patterns that made no sense to Roman thinking. They learned to watch, to imitate, to adapt. The smart ones realized that being Roman prisoners forever meant slow death, but being valuable soldiers in Parthian service meant a chance to live. Some resisted the idea, clinging to Roman identity. Others embraced it as pure survival. Most found something in between. They would serve, they would fight, they would do what was necessary to stay alive, but they would remember who they had been. As years passed, the surviving Romans became something new. Not quite Parthian, not quite Roman anymore, but soldiers who understood how to survive in a world that had no use for their old loyalty. They were about to need every one of those survival skills, because the Parthians were planning to move them even further east, to the very edge of the known world. 17 years after Carrhae, the surviving Romans found themselves in Kazakhstan, facing a new kind of battle that would change their fate forever. They were no longer prisoners. They had become something more valuable, experienced soldiers, serving as mercenaries for the Shingu Confederation. But experience they were about to learn
was useless when you faced an enemy that fought with the discipline and organization they had once known as Rome. The Chinese army approaching the fortress of Jiji was everything the Romans remembered about professional warfare. Organized, methodical, relentless. These weren't tribal warriors or desert raiders. These were imperial troops who understood siege warfare, who had engineers and supply lines and the kind of military machine that Rome had once possessed. For the Romans serving with the Xingdu, this battle represented more than just another fight it was a chance to use the skills they had learned during nearly 2 decades of survival in foreign lands. They had adapted Parthian cavalry tactics, learned Xingdu mobility, but deep down they still understood Roman formation fight. When the Chinese began their siege, the Romans found themselves in a unique position. They knew how to defend against exactly the kind of disciplined assault the Chinese were mounting. The fortress at Jiji wasn't a Roman fort, but it had Roman influence. The wooden palisades, the ditches, the careful attention to defensive positioning. These showed the handiwork of men who had once built Roman camps across Europe. The Romans had taught their new allies something about fortification, and now they would find out if those lessons were enough to survive. When the Chinese attacked, the Romans did what came naturally. They formed up in the tight, disciplined ranks that had been drilled into them decades before, shield against shield, presenting a wall of bronze and steel that the Chinese chroniclers would later describe as fish-scale formation. It wasn't exactly the testudo. They didn't have Roman shields anymore, and their equipment was a mixture of Parthian, Xingdu and improvised gear, but the principle was the same. For a moment it worked. The Chinese assault broke against the disciplined ranks like waves against a seawall. The Romans, fighting perhaps for the first time in years in something resembling their old style, held the wall. They remembered how to move as a unit, how to support each other, how to turn individual courage into collective strength. But fortresses fall, especially when they're surrounded by a professional army with proper siege equipment. The Chinese weren't going to give up and ride away like nomad raiders. They settled in for a systematic siege, cutting off water, stopping food supplies, building their own fortifications to prevent escape. This was Roman-style warfare turned against men who had once been Romans. When the end came, it came quickly. Jiji Chanyu, the Xingdu later, was killed. The fortress fell. The defenders who survived the final assault found themselves prisoners again. But this time their captors were impressed rather than contemptuous. The Chinese had seen something in the way these foreign soldiers fought. The Chinese captured 405 of these foreign soldiers after the battle and were so impressed with their skill that they asked them to enlist in their own army. This wasn't slavery or forced labor, this was recruitment. The Chinese needed experienced soldiers for their western frontier, and they had just captured a group of men who had proven they could fight in organized formation against overwhelming odds. For the surviving Romans, this moment represented the ultimate adaptation. They had started as conquerors, become prisoners, turned into mercenaries, and now they were being offered a chance to become something entirely new, soldiers in the service of an empire they had never imagined existed. The offer was practical rather than generous. The Chinese needed border guards against Tibetan raids. They needed men who understood both mobile warfare and defensive formations. They needed soldiers who could adapt to different enemies and different terrain. The Romans, after 17 years of learning to survive in foreign armies, had become exactly that kind of soldier. Accepting meant abandoning any hope of ever seeing Rome again. But for men who had already survived the impossible, who had learned to find purpose in service rather than conquest, it was an opportunity rather than a defeat. They would go east again into lands that were foreign even to the Chinese, and they would build something new. They then settled these soldiers on the border with Tibet, in a city that they named Ligen. For the surviving Romans, this wasn't just relocation. It was the ultimate test of everything they had learned about survival and adaptation over nearly 2 decades of forced wandering. Ligen, in what's now Gansu province, was frontier territory in every sense: harsh climate, constant threat of raids, and isolation that made their years in Parthian captivity seem cosmopolitan by comparison. The land itself was unforgiving. High altitude meant thin air that left men gasping during hard work. Winters brought snow and bitter cold that made even their memories of European winters seem mild. Summers were scorching and dry, with sandstorms that could strip skin and bury anything left unprotected. This wasn't the Mediterranean climate they had been born to, or even the desert heat they had learned to endure. This was something entirely different. Building shelter required learning completely new technique. There was little wood suitable for Roman-style construction, so they had to master Chinese building methods. Rammed earth walls, careful orientation to minimize wind exposure, heating systems that worked with available fuel. The Romans brought their knowledge of engineering and fortification, but they had to adapt it to local materials and conditions. Chinese tools were different from what they had used in Europe or learned to use in Parthia. Different handles, different weights, different techniques for the same basic tasks. A Roman who had once built bridges across European rivers had to learn how to construct irrigation channels using Chinese methods. Veterans who had built roads had to figure out how Chinese engineering solved the same problems with different approaches. Food production was another complete adaptation. Chinese agriculture was intensive rather than extensive, focused on maximum yield from carefully managed land rather than the broad farming they might have known in Italy. They learned to grow crops they had never seen, varieties of millet, different strains of wheat, vegetables that required techniques completely foreign to European farming. Cooking became a cultural bridge. Roman soldiers had always been practical about food, but Chinese cuisine used ingredients and methods that were entirely new. They learned to use chopsticks, to prepare rice properly, to blend flavors in ways that had nothing to do with Mediterranean cooking. But they also shared their own knowledge. Roman bread making, cheese production, where local conditions allowed, preservation techniques that worked in different climates. The Chinese had given them land and responsibilities, but they had also given them Chinese neighbors and Chinese expectations. Learning the language became essential for more than just military orders. They needed to understand local customs, local law, local ways of settling disputes. They had to figure out how to be foreign soldiers who were also community members. Marriage was perhaps the most significant adaptation. Even today, the people in the area around Lijian have distinctly European features such as blonde hair and blue or green eyes, and genetic testing has revealed that close to 2/3 of their DNA is Caucasian. This suggests that the Romans didn't just settle in the area, they integrated with local populations while maintaining some distinct identity. For men who had been soldiers their entire adult lives, learning to be farmers, craftsmen and family men required a different kind of courage than fighting battle. They had to learn patience with crops instead of enemies, planning for seasons instead of campaigns, building for permanence instead of temporary military needs. Defense was still their primary responsibility, but frontier defense in this region meant something different from what they had known. Tibetan raids were swift and mobile, more like the Parthian tactics they had learned to counter than the set-piece battles of their Roman past. They had to organize patrols, maintain watch posts and coordinate with Chinese military units using the communication and organizational skills they had developed over decades of service in foreign armies. But perhaps the most remarkable adaptation was culture. These men had to create a community identity that honored their Roman origins, while functioning within Chinese society. They had to decide what traditions to maintain, what practices to adopt, and how to pass on their history to children who would be more Chinese than Roman. They created something that had never existed before. A community of former Roman soldiers who had learned to survive by adaptation rather than conquest, who had traveled further than any Roman legion had ever gone, and who had found a way to make a life in the most foreign place imaginable. Whether this community was built by the historical Lost Legion or by some other group of Western soldiers, it represents the ultimate expression of military survival skills applied to civilian life. The truth about whether Romans actually reached China may be less important than what this story reveals about how soldiers survive when everything familiar disappears. The only remaining evidence needed to authenticate the story would be Roman coins or other artifacts at Lijian. But even without definitive proof, the theory forces us to confront a remarkable question. What does it take for people to not just survive, but thrive, when they're completely cut off from everything they've ever known? Modern archaeological evidence is frustratingly sparse. The only real hard evidence that Romans settled in the area is the skeleton housed in the Yongchan Museum. The remains were discovered back in 2003 in a 2,000-year-old grave, according to The Economist, and are of a 1.8-meter tall male, much larger than the average Chinese back then. One skeleton, even an unusually tall one, doesn't prove the presence of an entire Roman community, but it does suggest that someone very different from the local population lived and died in this remote Chinese frontier town. The genetic evidence is more compelling but also more complex. Genetic testing has revealed that close to 2/3 of their DNA is Caucasian. But genetic diversity in Central Asian populations along the Silk Road makes this evidence difficult to interpret definitively. Traders, diplomats, and other travelers had been moving between East and West for centuries. European features in a Silk Road community could come from many sources. What's more interesting from a survival perspective is what the story tells us about adaptability. Whether these were Romans from Karha or some other group of Western soldiers, the community that emerged in Legend represents an extraordinary example of cultural and practical adaptation. These people learned to survive and prosper in one of the most challenging environments imaginable, a frontier region, far from any familiar culture under constant threat of attack. The military evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Fish scale formation is a historical clue for Debs, who notes that the term is wholly unique in Chinese literature. He likens the concept of a fish-scale battle formation to that of the famous Roman testudo formation. But shield formations aren't unique to Rome. Any group of disciplined infantry facing archers would develop similar tactics. The real question is whether the specific description matches Roman methods closely enough to suggest Roman training. From a survival standpoint, the most impressive aspect of this story isn't whether it happened to Romans specifically, it's the implication that a group of foreign soldiers, regardless of their exact origin, managed to integrate into Chinese society while maintaining their military effectiveness and cultural identity. This requires a level of adaptability that goes beyond simple survival. It suggests people who learned to thrive by embracing change while preserving what was essential about themselves. The practical skills required for such adaptation are learning new languages, new fighting techniques, new agricultural methods, new social customs, new technologies, all while maintaining the discipline and organization that made them valuable to their Chinese employer. This isn't just survival, it's reinvention at a level that most people never achieve even when they're not forced to do it. Whether or not Roman legionaries actually founded Legend, the story represents something profound about human adaptability. It suggests that even in the ancient world, when travel was dangerous and communication was limited, people could cross vast distances, learn completely foreign ways of life, and create new communities that honored their past while embracing their future. For the men who may have made this journey, whether they were Romans from Karha or some other group of displaced soldiers, survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant learning to find purpose and identity in circumstances that would have broken people who were less adaptable. They learned that survival isn't about maintaining what you were, it's about discovering what you can become. In the end, the question isn't really whether Romans reached China. The question is what it tells us about the human capacity to adapt, survive, and even flourish when everything familiar disappears. Whether fact or legend, the story of the Lost Legion represents the ultimate expression of practical wisdom. When you can't go home, you learn to make wherever you are into home. And that, perhaps, is the most Roman thing of all.